Welcome back. So we've talked about the framework that we're going to use to talk about business cycles and recessions, namely the equation of exchange. And now we've talked about the symptoms of recessions as well, when we talked about unemployment of both labor and capital. So if you need a refresher on any of those before we get started, feel free to pull up the previous videos as well. Here we're going to start combining those and putting them together in order to have a general framework about how we're going to talk about recessions. So first of all, what do we mean by recessions? Recessions are characterized by falling real GDP, right? So people are getting poorer, the economy is producing less, as well as rising unemployment of both labor and capital, right? So not only are people unemployed, they could be producing something but they're not, but also capital goods are unemployed too. All kinds of productive resources that could be producing things aren't. Recessions are also going to be characterized by deflation, or at least disinflation. Now, the difference between deflation and disinflation is that deflation means that the price level is falling. Disinflation means that the price level is still rising, but it's rising more slowly than it was before. So the rate of inflation is falling, but it's not negative yet. Now, booms are going to be the opposite of recessions. Booms are going to be characterized by rising real GDP, so people are getting richer, or at least they feel like they're getting richer, falling unemployment, or overemployment even, of both labor and capital. What do we mean by overemployment? We'll get to that later on. Booms are very often inflationary. So when there's a boom, you'll see prices starting to rise, or the rise in prices start to accelerate. Now, not every fall in real GDP, however, is a recession. And not every rise in real GDP is a boom, right? So we want to distinguish between what are called real shocks and nominal shocks, right? We don't want to say that economic growth is the same as a boom, right? A boom is going to be temporary. A boom is short run, whereas economic growth, hopefully, is going to be long run. By the same token, there are falls in real GDP that are permanent, that permanently affect the US's productive capacity, and then there are falls that are temporary. And we're only going to want to call those temporary ones recessions. So how do you tell the difference? Well, one way of eyeballing it is that recessions tend to cause all industries to move together, or at least most industries to move together. So in normal times, you're going to have some industries that are doing well, some industries that are doing poorly, and there's going to be kind of a constant churn, right? So maybe your steel manufacturers are doing really well, maybe your plastic manufacturers are doing less well. And so there's movement all throughout the economy, right? And you don't see everybody doing well at once necessarily, right? Because that's the process of competition. That's the normal competitive process where resources get allocated to their most valued uses. It requires that sort of churn, or the phrase sometimes used is creative destruction. Now, a business cycle looks somewhat different. In a business cycle, industries are going to be correlated in terms of how well they're doing, right? So in a recession, you're going to have lots and lots of industries slump all at once. That's kind of unusual, right? Why would everything be slumping at once? Or during a boom, you might see everything doing really well at once. And why would that happen either? And we'll answer that question later on today. But for now, let me show you an example from the first couple decades of the 21st century. Right, so this pulls out three different industries in the US: freight, manufacturing, and technology. And what you can see here is that in 2002, right, 2002, on our definition, is not actually going to count as a recession. This was a real shock to the technology industry, right? Because it didn't really affect these other industries. And the collapse in the tech industry was so bad that it registered as on the same scale as a recession. But we're going to call that a real shock, right? Because it permanently affected the productive capacity of that tech industry, right? Or at least it affected expectations of the productivity of the tech industry. So during this period of time, from 2000 to 2008, you don't really see a lot of correlation, right? The tech industry falls a lot during 2002, picks back up from 04 to 08, Manufacturers are doing pretty well over that period of time. Trucking is kind of constant. And then 2008 hits. In 2008, you see a correlation both on the downturn and on the upswing. Right? So everybody slumps at once, regardless of what industry you're in. And after 2008, starting in 2009 and going through 2011, everybody kind of recovers at once. That's interesting, right? In the normal churn of economic activity, why would you expect that to happen? After that, you see a period of uncorrelation. We'll call this normal times again. And then more recently, from 2016 to about 2019, right, this is looking strongly like a boom. Right? Everybody's kind of picking up at once. Now, even more recently than that, right, we've got a kind of big economic crisis happening right now. Does that count as a recession? I'm going to argue no. Right? What's happening recently is much more similar to 2002 than it is to 2008. Right? So let me give you an example. Charmin is doing really well. Right? If you bought stock in Charmin, you're probably doing all right now. On the other hand, you have companies like American Airlines doing very poorly. Right? So you have shifts in demand. Right? You don't have a general decline in demand, but you have shifts from some things to other things. Right, so we're going to call this a real shock to the US's productive capacity. And real shocks are going to be different from business cycles. Other examples of real shocks would be things like war. If you go and blow up all the German factories, for example, you've permanently affected Germany's productive capacity. That's not a business cycle. Their real income is lower, but that's a real shock. Right? They're going to have to actually rebuild in order to get back to the growth path that they were at before. So before we answer the question of how that correlation happens, I want to set the stage here and emphasize again that business cycles are disequilibria. Right? So in lecture 7, I argued that unemployment is a puzzle. Why? Because it implies an arbitrage opportunity. Right? Arbitrage is what allows resources to flow to their most productive uses. And if there's lots of resources unemployed, or if they're not flowing to their most productive uses, right, that seems like it would imply an opportunity for somebody to use them productively. But for some reason, that's not happening. So what we see is that the quantity supplied of goods, of labor, of productive assets in general, right, the quantity supplied is going to be greater than the quantity demanded. So markets are not clearing. We have surpluses. Now think about what usually happens when quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded. Right? If you're a manager at the store and you see something like cereal piling up on the shelves, the quantity supplied of cereal is greater than the quantity demanded. What do? You have a sale. And by cutting the price, you're going to bring the market back into equilibrium. Right? There are incentives built in for you to adjust the price until quantity supplied equals quantity demanded. Right? So prices are going to fall in general. And for some reason, that's not happening during recessions. And we're going to say the same thing for booms, right? During a boom, quantity demanded is going to be greater than quantity supplied. We're going to have shortages. And what happens usually when there are shortages? At least when there are not laws against dealing with shortages, as there are, for example, with toilet paper right now. Right? Usually what's going to happen is if you're persistently selling more cereal than you're taking in, you're going to raise the price. Right? You're going to maybe not put the cereal on sale and raise prices as much as you're allowed to until quantity supplied equals quantity demanded. That's how you get to that equilibrium price. And again, during booms, for some reason this isn't happening, or at least it's not happening quickly. It's not happening instantaneously. So the question we're going to be asking here is, in the case of labor markets, or in any of our other markets, wages are going to be too high. Right? We don't have a market clearing wage, and so we're going to have unemployment. Right? So again, we have our labor supply here that slopes up because the more you get paid, the more you want to work. And we have a downward sloping labor demand curve because the more employers have to pay, the less labor they're going to demand. Now, suppose again, we're not at the equilibrium wage. Suppose we're not at that intersection point. Instead, we're up here. We'll call this the prevailing wage. At the prevailing wage, the quantity demanded is going to be down here, right? Because labor is expensive enough that employers don't want to hire too much. But the supply is going to be out here because at that wage, more people are willing to work, right? So maybe you get a higher labor force participation rate. So that gap's going to be unemployment. And this diagram looks exactly the same as the one we drew last time for the minimum wage, right? If the minimum wage is higher than that equilibrium wage, then you're going to get unemployment. But this isn't minimum wage, right? Because minimum wage would be structural unemployment. But by hypothesis, cyclical unemployment is something other than structural unemployment, keeping wages too high. Right? So why would wages be too high in a business cycle or during a recession? Right? That's the puzzle that we're going to try to explore this time. You can actually see the same thing happening with goods and with capital, with everything else. Right? We draw the same diagram except with prices and output instead of labor and wages. And what we see is we have surpluses. We'll call this unsold inventory. Right? The cereal's piling up on your shelf and you're not able to sell it, especially for bigger items, non-consumption items, right? These are going to be much more difficult to sell during a recession. So we're going to have prices that are too high. So all of these markets, the labor market, the goods markets, all of these different industries, right, they're all moving together, where quantity supplied is going to be greater than quantity demanded. So in order to answer this question, we're going to need to know, first of all, why aren't prices changing? Suppose that there's some necessity for prices to change, and prices don't change. All of a sudden you're in disequilibrium, even though the price hasn't changed. Right? So we're going to want to know why they're not changing. And second, why was it necessary for them to change in the first place? Right? So if supply changes or demand changes and the price doesn't change, then you have disequilibrium. So we're going to want to know, first of all, why the price isn't changing, and second, what caused it to be necessary for prices to change in the first place. Now, the answer to the first question, we're going to ascribe to something called sticky prices. If any of you ever seen these blue things before, these sticky hands, you throw them against the wall. You used to get them for Halloween, and they'd stick to the wall, and they'd get pretty gross, but they were pretty fun. Right, so prices are going to communicate information on supply and demand in general, right? This is a theme we've emphasized over and over throughout the class, is that prices give you information on scarcity in order to allow people to coordinate their production decisions and their consumption decisions, right? So quantity supplied equals quantity demanded. And prices are going to change and be responsive to supply or demand changes, right? Anytime goods become more or less scarce, the opportunity cost of those goods, and therefore the price on the margin, is going to change. But that process takes time. Prices don't change immediately. And especially in markets where things aren't traded frequently, prices can take a while to change. And we're going to call that sticky prices, right? When prices don't change in response to a change in supply or demand. And there's a number of reasons that prices might be sticky. We'll go through a few of those here. First of all, prices might be sticky because of unclear signals, right? So again, prices are a signal. And if the meaning of that signal is unclear to you, then prices might be less good at doing their job. So think back to the example of the baker, when the vacuum sucked up all the money out of people's pockets. And you open your store, and half as many people show up. The moral of that story was that eventually you're going to have an incentive to cut your prices to move that inventory. But think about this maybe a little more concretely. Right? Under what circumstances would you actually cut your prices? And how long would it take you to do so? Right? If you expect that the slow sales are temporary, if you expect that people will come back tomorrow, then you're not going to cut your prices today, right? Suppose that it's raining outside, and you say, well, maybe people are just not showing up because it's raining. Maybe there's bad weather, or maybe this is just a slow day, just for no reason at all. Right? So you're not going to cut your prices if you expect this is going to be temporary. So the question we're going to ask here is, how many days of low demand does it take you to figure, well, maybe this isn't temporary, right? Maybe this is going to go on forever. And maybe I need to cut my prices now. you don't do that immediately, but you've got to do it eventually. Right? And in the meantime, you're going to have slow demand, right? And your prices are going to be sticky. The second reason prices might be sticky is what we're going to call menu costs. And the basic idea of menu costs is that it's costly to change your prices. So suppose that you own a restaurant. You're Joe, and you figured out, you've run the numbers based on the demand, based on your costs, that the optimal profit maximizing price for you is going to be charging $7.99 for this cashew chicken stir fry. Now suppose that demand conditions change and you rerun the numbers and the optimal price is now $8.13. Are you going to change your prices? Are you going to reprint all your menus for a 14-cent difference? Probably not. Right? So if it's costly to change your prices, to, for example, reprint your menus, you're going to be willing to tolerate the wrong price for longer until it gets, maybe the optimal price gets up to $8.50 or maybe even $9. So until demand conditions get out of whack enough to meet that threshold, then prices are going to be sticky in the meantime. A third reason that prices might be sticky is long-term labor contracts. Right? Suppose that as an employer, you've made a promise to maintain wages for 3 years and to renegotiate labor contracts every 3 years. Right? That means that if supply and demand conditions change over those 3 years, you're not going to be able to change the wage. Right? So if you're only able to change wages every 3 years, and even then, only by a certain percentage, if demand conditions change, then it's going to be difficult for people to get back to an equilibrium wage, right? Because wages are a price too. And this is mostly going to explain downward stickiness, right? Because nobody's going to complain if the demand for labor increases and then employers pay more, right? People are only going to complain when the demand for labor falls, and then wages ought to fall, but then they don't, right? Because of these kinds of contracts. That's when people complain. And I want to emphasize too that when we are talking about sticky prices and recessions, or sticky prices and booms, right, we're talking about sticky prices overall. We're not talking about particular sticky prices, which would cause disequilibria in particular markets. For example, price gouging laws prohibit the increase in price of things like toilet paper during an emergency. So we see a shortage in toilet paper, right? The price of toilet paper is sticky. But that's only going to be one market, right? We're going to be interested in things that might cause prices to be sticky overall, right? If all prices need to change, and then lots of them are sticky, right, we can call that a recession. Whereas if just a couple prices need to change, and they're sticky, that's going to cause shortages and surpluses in those markets, but not an overall recession. So if prices are sticky overall, if prices in general need to change, and they don't, then wrong prices can last for some amount of time. Right? And if prices are too high, there are going to be surpluses. If prices need to fall and they don't, there's going to be surpluses. This is what we're going to call recession. Right? This is how we get unemployment, surpluses of labor, surpluses of goods, surpluses of productive resources, because prices in general are too high. They need to fall and they are not able to. On the other hand, during a boom, if prices are too low, and they can't rise, right? There's going to be shortages, and we're going to get overemployment, and we're going to get booms, and eventually we're going to get inflation. So this gives us a new perspective on the association between deflations and recession. Right? So lots of people will look at the relationship between deflation and recession and say, well, deflation is so strongly linked with recession that we ought to avoid deflation at all costs. But does that make sense? Well, the thing is that recessions last until deflation happens. Right? Recessions are not caused by deflation. Recessions are caused by the need for deflation. And then the actual deflation, when prices are adjusting, that's what gets you out of the recession, right? When prices actually do the falling. And there are ways you can avoid that, the need for falling prices, but we'll get to that later when we talk about monetary policy. For now, it's important to emphasize that if you prevent prices from falling, if you say, well, we're not changing demand conditions, we're not changing supply conditions, but we're going to make sure that prices don't fall. The recession is going to last longer. So here's an example. In your civics class in high school, right, there's a very common stereotype that Hoover did nothing during the Great Depression. And that was bad, and we needed somebody to do something, and then FDR came in and did something, and then things were better. Right, that's kind of the opposite of the right story. Right? Hoover was not do nothing. Right? In fact, Hoover did a lot. And in fact, he did the same things that FDR did. And most of them were actually harmful. Right, so here's an example. This study found that Hoover's policy of keeping wages high made the Great Depression 3 times worse than it otherwise would have been. Right, so what did he do? He would go around from business to business and say, hey, that's it's a nice looking business you got there. Be a shame if somebody were to nationalize it. And that might happen if you cut wages. So businesses are facing all these declining demand conditions, and they're not able to keep these workers, and they're not able to really cut their wages either. Right? So what happened? Hiring froze. Right? By keeping industrial wages too high, this says, Hoover sharply depressed employment beyond where it otherwise would have been, and that act drove down overall GDP below where it otherwise would have been. Right? So by cajoling these businesses, by threatening them, and by cutting deals to either maintain or even raise wages, right? Wages need to fall to get to that equilibrium level because prices are falling in general, but they're not. Right? So unemployment is the result. This is one way that the prevailing wage can be higher than the equilibrium wage, even without actual laws, right? Even if it's just implicit threats or something like that. So what did firms do? If they're not able to lower wages and they're faced with declining demand conditions, well, they just hire fewer workers. There were layoffs. If you have to pay workers more than what you would otherwise need to, more than demand conditions warrant, you're not going to be able to afford as many. So there's lots of layoffs, lots of reductions in hours. And this was a major factor in how bad the Great Depression was, and how long it was, and why it took so long to recover, because prices were prevented from falling to where they needed to be. So this gives us an answer to our first question. Why aren't prices changing? Well, because of sticky prices. And sticky prices make it difficult for prices to change for a variety of reasons, right? Any number of the reasons that prices might be sticky. And you can think of other reasons too, right? These are not exhaustive by any means. So now let's move on to our second question, the second part of our explanation of recessions. What made it necessary for prices to change in the first place? Why are all these businesses facing diminished demand conditions? And the answer to this one, we're going to say, is changes in the volume of spending. So suppose that we increase the money supply. Right? If we increase the money supply, then we've increased the volume of spending. Or if we decrease the demand for money, we've also increased the volume of spending. Right? Because now people are willing to spend money rather than to hold it, right? And the volume of spending rises. More purchases happen over the same period of time. So in either case, people are going to have more money to spend. Think back to our helicopter story earlier. Right? People are going to spend that money until prices rise. Right? They've satisfied their demand for money, and anything beyond that they get, they're going to be willing to spend. Right? They're going to want the goods instead of the money. Right? Eventually prices are going to rise until the real money supply returns back to where it was. Right? Until everybody's willing to hold the money that exists in the economy. But until that happens, until those prices rise, and the money supply is now out of whack with the demand for money, people's real demand for goods is going to be higher than it otherwise would have been. People are going to be able to afford more goods than they otherwise would have. So that's how we get shortages in a boom. So sticky prices, because prices don't rise immediately, mean that you have more money and are able to buy things at the same old prices. So you're going to be able to increase your demand for goods, but there's not necessarily going to be enough goods to satisfy that demand. And that's why prices have to rise eventually. But until they do, that's what we're going to call a boom. So let's go back to this diagram. When the supply of money changes, or the demand for money changes, in either case, if money becomes less scarce, if there's more of it or if people demand less of it, there's going to be pressure on all of the prices that are expressed in terms of money, which is to say all of them. Right? So the price level is going to go up. Wages are going to go up. The exchange rate is going to go up. And the price of bonds is going to go up too, which is to say that the interest rate is going to go down. Right? So this is the opposite because the interest rate is that inverse of the price of bonds. Right? Those of you who are finance majors, this will be familiar to you. Those of you who aren't, don't worry. Just keep in mind here that the price of bonds is doing the same thing as all the other ones. Now let's run through this same story in the opposite direction. Suppose money becomes more scarce. So suppose that the demand for money increases. Right? So now people want to hold money rather than spend it. And so the velocity of money is going to fall. If people are trying to hold it, then the flow of money through the economy, right, the rate at which $1 changes hands per year, that rate is going to fall. So people are going to spend less, and the volume of spending is going to fall. And producers are going to have to cut prices in order to induce people to spend again. Right? This was our vacuum story from earlier. Right? Same thing happens if the supply of money is cut, as if the demand for money rises. In either case, money becomes scarcer. Right? So the signal to cut prices comes from lower demand. But until the prices get cut, that lower demand is going to imply decreased GDP and a recession and surpluses, right? Things aren't getting sold because the prices are still too high. They need to fall, but they haven't yet. So same thing in terms of this diagram, right? Money becomes scarcer, right? The supply falls or the demand for it rises. And so the price of goods is going to have to fall. Wages are going to have to fall. The exchange rate is going to have to fall. And the price of bonds is going to fall too, which is to say that the interest rate is going to rise. Right, so we can tell this story in terms of the equation of exchange. Right, so suppose the money supply expands. So M goes up, but P is sticky. Right, so in the short run, we're not going to be able to change P. In the story we told last week, which is the long run story, any changes in M have to be absorbed by P eventually. But if P is sticky in the short run, that's not going to be an option. So what happens? Real income is going to rise in the short run. Remember, this equation has to be true at all times. Right? So if M rises and P doesn't rise, we're going to have a short-term rise in real income. And eventually, that's going to die back down. Right? Eventually, prices are going to rise. And when they do, that increase in real income is going to get choked back off. All this extra money that people feel like they have available to them to spend. So prices are going to rise until all that extra money that people are spending is necessary for them to hold in order to make the kinds of purchases they plan on making. So this is the exact same story that we told earlier with the M equals M over P, which gave us a long-run theory of inflation. The only difference here is that now we can see what's happening in the short run as well. Now I also want to emphasize that there's some amount of symmetry between booms and recessions. Now, recessions feel bad. There's unemployment and people feel poorer, unemployment is high and production is low, and booms feel better, right? Because we have low unemployment and people feel richer because they have more money, they're able to afford more. But here's the thing. From an efficiency perspective, shortages are just as bad as surpluses. Right? Both of these are failures to allocate resources to their most valued uses. So why do booms feel good then? Why is it the case that we feel good when maybe this is actually making us poorer? Well, think back to the last lecture about unemployment. And we brought in this concept of pseudo-unemployment. Right? This is our backup generator. These are our people on vacation. This is our planned inventory. Right? These are all these resources whose most valuable use is being available. And you don't want an economy where all of your resources are always being used all at once. Right? You want some amount of slack in order to absorb shocks. Right? So if you're bringing your backup generator into employment, you're not going to have anything left over for when the power goes out. If your firemen are out playing cards all day and you hire them to do something else and now you have no firemen, what happens when you have a burning house? Right, so these are the kinds of things that happen during booms. Resources become overemployed. Right? You have resources that ought to be available, but they're not available because now we have to use them. Now it's more profitable to use them rather than have them be available. So you get kind of false price signals that bring these resources into employment that ought to not be employed at all. So the economy is going to become more fragile in this case. It's going to become less able to withstand shocks. All right, so this is Roy Williams. Roy Williams is the coach at Carolina where I went to school. And sometimes you'll hear coaches say things like, I want you to give me 110%. Now, you might think that this is just coach speak for do your best. But it is possible to run over capacity, right? You can play extra hard. You can really go at it. But you can't do that forever, right? It's costly. You might be more likely to tear a ligament, or you might be more tired afterward, and you might not be able to play as hard later in the game, right? So you can overextend yourself, and economies can do the same thing. They can run at overcapacity, but only temporarily. This is Herbert Stein. He has a famous quote that says, if something can't go on forever, it won't. Right? So the economy can't run at overemployment levels forever. It can't keep using up its pseudo-unemployed resources. And when prices rise, that's an indication that the economy can't sustain that boom output, right? Because the economy hasn't gotten any more productive, right? All you're doing is bringing those pseudo-unemployed resources into production. You're getting lower inventory. You're drawing people back in to the labor force that maybe didn't want to be in the labor force. And eventually, when prices adjust, right, your real income is going to be exactly the same as what it was. Because in the long run, an economy's real income is determined by its productive capacity, not by the amount of money that it has. Right? So eventually, any changes in the money supply or the volume of spending that affect real income can only be temporary. And this works in reverse too. Right? So suppose the money supply contracts. So M goes down, but P is sticky. What has to happen? Well, spending is going to be slow. Right? Now people are trying to build back up their money balances, and so they're not going to go to the store. They're going to postpone their shopping decisions. So real income is going to fall, but only temporarily. Eventually, once prices do fall, real income is going to rise back to where it was. Because again, you have all these unemployed resources that could be producing things but aren't. Eventually, they're going to be able to go back into production, and the economy's real income, again, is going to be determined by its productive capacity in the long run, not by the amount of money. Right? The amount of money can affect things in the short run, but not in the long run. And one last thing here, remember that aggregate demand refers to the volume of spending, refers to aggregate demand for goods. Right? Now, the demand for goods, remember, is the opposite of the demand for money. Right? The more demand for money you have, the less demand for goods you have, and vice versa. So don't get confused with aggregate demand and the demand for money. Those are different, and in fact, they're opposites. Now, this temporariness, the fact that an economy's real income is always going to be determined in the long run by its productive capacity and not by the volume of spending. This is what we're going to call the neutrality of money. Right? And the neutrality of money says that any time that real income is affected by changes in the volume of spending, prices are going to adjust eventually. Not necessarily immediately, but eventually prices are going to adjust. You're going to recover from that recession. You're going to come down from that boom. And you're going to get a real income that's in line with the economy's productive capacity. So changes in the volume of spending can affect real income, but only in the short run. And any effects you get are going to die down after a little while. And the more people expect them, the faster they're going to die down. Here's some evidence for this. This is a chart we've seen before. This is the correlation between real income growth, growth in real GDP, and growth in the money supply. and you see essentially no correlation. Right? In fact, high money supply growth might even be bad for your economy. And if you stimulate it enough that way, it's going to wear off, just the same as an addiction. Right? You're going to need ever higher doses in order to get the same kind of effect. Now, why would that be? This is something called the Phillips curve. Right? And the Phillips curve is an instructive example of why this would be the case. The Phillips curve is a supposed negative relationship between inflation and unemployment, developed by a guy named Phillips based on data from the US and Great Britain from the 20th century, in about the 1960s. And this might make a little bit of sense based on what we've talked about so far. Right, so you might be able to tell a story like, well, if you have higher inflation, your volume of spending is rising, and you're going to get lower unemployment, right? You're going to get kind of that boom response. So if prices are sticky, maybe the Phillips curve kind of makes sense, right? So this is what the Phillips curve looked like in the 1960s. And you can see a pretty nice negative relationship here between 1958 and 1969. The higher inflation was, the lower unemployment was, and vice versa. The lower inflation was, the higher unemployment was. And you can see that this is kind of going up over time. In the early 1960s, late 1950s, we were at this low inflation, high unemployment. Later in the 60s, we figured out, hey, maybe we'd like more inflation and less unemployment. Maybe inflation is okay if it means less unemployment. And so by the time you get up to 67, 68, 69, you're getting up here into this 6% inflation territory and pretty low unemployment. Now, how well did this work out? Well, here's the Phillips curve in the 1970s. And you can still see that nice relationship from the 60s, but what happens in the 70s? Really no relationship at all. And as a matter of fact, you move from that corner with the high inflation, low unemployment, and you start spinning out here up into this territory up into the upper right-hand corner. You start getting in the mid-70s and especially the late 70s. You get high inflation and high unemployment. Right? This is what was called stagflation, stagnation and high inflation. Right? Based on the Phillips curve logic, this wasn't supposed to happen. Right? Phillips curve logic says you have a negative relationship. You have a trade-off. And you should get high of one, low of the other. And maybe you get to choose. But during the 70s, we had high both. Right? We had high inflation and high unemployment. How does that work? Right? Why did that happen? As a matter of fact, if you trace the Phillips curve out throughout the rest of the 20th century and into the present day, really no relationship at all, except for the 1960s. Right? The 1960s was the only time you got that nice, clean relationship. Otherwise, not a really clear relationship. Right? That yellow segment up there, that's the 1970s, high inflation, high unemployment. That blue line down at the bottom to the right, that's more recently. Right? But you can see that we've been kind of everywhere in the whole space of these outcomes. Right? So what we see here is that the Phillips curve is really not stable. Right? It's not a stable relationship. And the moral of the story here is that when you increase the volume of spending, the only unemployment you're affecting is cyclical unemployment. You're not affecting structural unemployment, you're not affecting technological unemployment, you're not affecting frictional unemployment. All you're doing is affecting cyclical unemployment, right? Because the others are determined by real factors, right? They're not determined by the money supply, they're determined by technology or by preferences or by regulations or things like that. The only unemployment that the money supply or the volume of spending is going to be able to affect is that cyclical unemployment. And cyclical unemployment only lasts as long as it takes for prices to change. So if we start getting overemployment, if we start pushing cyclical unemployment into negative territory, inflation is going to keep going up, but that employment boost is only going to be temporary. So this is an idea called the natural rate of unemployment. The natural rate of unemployment refers to all the unemployment that comes about from real factors. That's going to be your frictional, your structural, and your technological unemployment, right? Things that are not affected by the volume of spending. So after prices have adjusted, right, you're going to get some amount of unemployment. You're going to get some amount of frictional, some amount of structural, some amount of technological. So cyclical unemployment can be negative. Right? We can push into that overemployment territory, but only temporarily, only until prices rise. And prices are going to keep rising and stay risen even after that overemployment has gone away. By the same token, in a recession, right, cyclical employment is going to be high, but only temporarily. Right? As prices fall, that unemployment is going to go away. Right? You're going to get deflation, but you're going to get a recovery in employment. So let's redraw the Phillips curve for the long run. We can imagine the original Phillips curve as something like a short-run Phillips curve. And the long-run Phillips curve is going to be vertical. What does that mean? Well, because we're plotting the relationship between inflation and unemployment, a vertical line says that unemployment in the long run is going to be whatever it's going to be based on real factors, regardless of the rate of inflation. So eventually, no matter what the volume of spending is doing, eventually the rate of unemployment is going to go back to that natural rate. Now you can move along the short-run Phillips curve in the short run, but eventually, when prices rise, you're always going to get back to that long-run Phillips curve. You're always going to be sitting at that natural rate of unemployment. So let's think about what happens when we try to play the short-run Phillips curve. Let's say that we look at that Phillips curve and we say, hey, we'd rather have the high inflation and low unemployment. Right? That's what the US said in the 60s and 70s. That's what President Johnson said. That's what President Nixon said. So we move up here. Right? We move up in inflation and lower in unemployment. So in the short run, this trade-off seems to work, or sometimes seems to work. Right? And they found this during the 60s. But that can't last, right? If something can't go on forever, it won't. So now we're off the long-run Phillips curve. And we got to get back there somehow. So in the long run, that short-run Phillips curve is going to shift. And you're going to need that same rate of inflation just to maintain where you were before. Right? And if you want to cut inflation, what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to increase unemployment just in order to decrease inflation. Right? And eventually, again, you're going to get back, but it's going to be painful. Right? That's what we learned in the 1980s when Paul Volcker cut the rate of growth of the money supply, sent the US into a really severe recession, but he broke the inflation. Right? Because inflation was so high, and we'd returned to that natural rate. Right? In fact, the natural rate was getting even higher because the inflation was so high that we're kind of distorting price signals. Right? So the economy is becoming less efficient. So in order to get back to that low inflation, we're going to have to send the economy into a recession. We're going to have to move along that short-run Phillips curve and get a recession until prices fall or until the inflation stops. And then we'll be back at that same rate of unemployment as we were before, but it's going to be painful to get there. All right, so this is the corollary of the neutrality of money, is this long-run Phillips curve. Right? In the long run, the economy is always going to return to that natural rate of unemployment, regardless of the inflation rate. So here's some evidence for this. Right, this is a similar graph as the last one, except instead of growth in the money supply, we're measuring here inflation. And what we see here is that just like growth in the money supply had basically no effect on long-run growth, neither does inflation. Neither does growth in the price level. And that makes sense if in the long run, growth in the price level and growth in the money supply are very closely linked, which we saw in one of these graphs in a previous lecture. Now, one last thing I want to emphasize here is why the Phillips curve broke down in the 1970s. And fundamentally, this is going to have something to do with expectations, and specifically expectations of what prices are going to do in the future. Now, the neutrality of money tells us that changes in the volume of spending are going to have an effect only in the short run. And they're only going to have that effect in the short run if prices don't change immediately. Right? They're going to change eventually, but in the meantime, right, we get that short run output boost or output diminishment, depending on whether we have a recession or a boom. So expectations are going to determine how fast prices adjust to new information. Right? And if people expect inflation, people are going to update their prices faster. Prices are going to be less sticky. So think back to this example of the baker again. And all these people are coming into your shop and buying your croissants. And you don't know whether this is going to be temporary or not. And so it might take you a little while to raise your prices. But now suppose you open the financial news and you see that Jerome Powell last week doubled the money supply. Now you have a pretty good sense of why this is happening. You have a pretty good sense that this demand isn't going to go away unless you raise your prices. So you might be more willing now that you expect this inflation, you might be more willing to raise your prices sooner. So what this implies is that the Phillips curve really only works, and you really only get a boom response if that inflation is a surprise. Right? If people expect it, they're going to raise their prices quickly. So this gives us a sense of why the Phillips curve seemed to work in the 60s and then why it broke down later on. Up until the 1960s and all the way through the 1960s, the US was on the gold standard, or at least kind of the vestiges of the gold standard. The US dollar was redeemable for gold, at least for other central banks, and other central banks would redeem their currencies for dollars. Right, so inflation was pretty low up until the 1960s because the supply of money was constrained by the supply of gold, at least somewhat. So under the gold standard, you'd get inflation sometimes, and you get deflation other times, but it would average out to about zero. Right? So any year you got inflation, you'd expect deflation the next year. And your average expectation would be that inflation is going to be zero. So any inflation you do get under a gold standard regime is going to be unexpected. And if people are coming into your bake shop, you're going to know that that's temporary. And so you're going to be less inclined to raise your prices based on 1 or 2 days of data. Right? So prices are going to be stickier under these circumstances where people don't expect inflation. Now what happens in the 1970s? Well, people's expectations changed. Right? In 1971, Nixon takes the US off the gold standard. Says that, well, the US dollar was redeemable for gold, was a promise to pay gold. We're not doing that anymore. Right? So now there's nothing constraining the supply of US dollars. And with that new power, right, Nixon was able to cajole the Fed, as we saw earlier, to stimulate the economy, to expand the volume of spending, and to keep unemployment low. So Nixon and Johnson both had this idea of the Phillips curve in their head. Right? And they're trying to keep unemployment low to help re-election prospects. But this only happens temporarily, right? Unemployment can't remain permanently lower than that natural rate, right? Because you're bringing in these pseudo-unemployed resources into production. You're running the economy at 110%. Can't go on like that forever. And as a matter of fact, the economy is now becoming less efficient because these price signals with high inflation are becoming more distorted. Right? So people start updating their expectations more quickly. And they say that, well, if there's more people in my store today, that probably means there's going to be inflation. And I may as well raise my prices today so that I don't have to do that tomorrow. Right? So people got used to it. Right? People started raising their prices. Prices became less sticky. And when prices become less sticky, when prices move immediately, well, you don't get any kind of output response at all. Right? You change the volume of spending, prices change immediately, and there's no effect really. So that's how we get stagflation. Right? Not only are you getting no boom response because people are updating their prices, but also you've distorted the price system in general. So the economy is becoming less efficient as well. So high inflation and also stagnation. That's how you get into that upper quadrant of the Phillips curve space. So let's sum up here. We've answered our 2 questions about where business cycles come from. Business cycles happen because the volume of spending changes. Right? Prices need to change because the volume of spending changes. Right? That can cause all prices in the whole economy to need to rise or to need to fall. And then prices don't change very often because they're sticky. Right? If people don't see it coming, if people don't expect that inflation or deflation, then there's going to be some short-run output response, but only in the short run, right? This is never going to be permanent. So we have most of an explanation here as to the causes of recessions and how we analyze them. But one thing that we've left unanswered is, well, why would the volume of spending change in the first place? And we've kind of hinted at a few answers to this question, but we're going to answer that much more thoroughly here next video. In the meantime, the reading assignment is going to be chapter 15 of the textbook. We're going to talk about monetary policy, fiscal policy, and this is going to be useful for talking about that in the next video. So enjoy the rest of your day, and I will see you then.